every time I see a flashback from a fashion show that happened in the past, it's something incredibly stylish and just looking so good. It's usually from 1998. If you see a somewhat vintage but moderately modern looking runway look that makes you go, wow, this is iconic, chances are it's from 1998. Now, I'll be talking about the shows that were labeled as 1998, but as we know, fashion shows often happen in advance, so some of those may have happened around 1997 as well. So what was it about 1998 that made fashion look so good? Of course, since fashion nowadays is heavily 19 inspired, a lot of the looks could easily be worn nowadays, and we might be just a little biased considering them hot. But I personally believe something truly special must have happened at the turn of the millennium. Let's rewind. Despite the 80s that were sort of imprinted in our pop culture, all the neon sportswear and bossy suits, the 80s were actually a little conservative fashion-wise. They mostly drew from previous decades such as 40s, 50s, and when they didn't, the designs come off as a little tacky nowadays, mostly because there is just so much going on, especially when it comes to evening wear. There is just so much. Ruffles, bows, questionable color combinations, glitter, shiny fabrics, and most of all the sheer volume of both the skirts and the sleeves just made a lot of them age pretty poorly. Like, sure, they're a lot of fun, but if someone wore that to the red carpet nowadays, I highly doubt they will make the best dressed list because they're just so 80s and it's difficult for us to separate them from that. And still, even the most experimental 80s designs were still not too groundbreaking, no offense, because fashion was sort of going from completely wearable to basically art. And for the most part, back in the 80s, fashion was still all about glamour and class and basically pieces that you can still wear. I personally think what happened in the 90s was that the runway fashions started shifting from what they used to be, from a classy showcase of sort of proposed styles and luxury clothing that rich people bought and wore, to an artistic expression of the designer and to an actual show. Like, I don't know if you've watched any late 90s, early 2000s fashion shows, but a lot of them were whole, like, spectacles. So 90s is sort of in between, which makes it a really good combination, because on one hand you have absolutely stunning artistry, and on the other hand you have styles that still sort of make sense if someone wanted to wear it. As in, they're not completely decomposed or devoid of any structure. And while it's already heading to, you know, fashion is art direction, 90s fashion still has a lot of that vintage glamour that we find so appealing. There is a lot of flashbacks to vintage fashion, especially in the haute couture shows. And it seems like 30s and 40s were the decades that was used a lot as inspiration in the 90s. And let's face it, classic looks just age really well. And also contrasting with the 80s retro inspirations, the 90s had a lot more minimalistic approach to drawing from previous fashions, mostly focusing on like accessories or the overall silhouette, which I think also contributed to the agelessness of the 90s fashion. You're watching this video, which means you're spending time on the internet. Now, if you spend a lot of time on the internet, you probably know it can be a place that is not so safe. There is a lot of security threats awaiting you out there. If you don't know what those threats might be, here are some examples. Sometimes all it takes is you click the wrong ad, and that's enough for the hackers to get your device compromised. You also get phishing links, which look like regular websites but are actually fake websites. And if you fall for it and give them your login and password, you're in for a ride. So all it takes is a simple mistake for your devices to be in danger. That's why it's good to have some sort of protection when you're perusing the web, and NordVPN, who is sponsoring today's video, offers you that sort of protection. NordVPN detects those traps and protects you from those traps. NordVPN will also be helpful if you're trying to access content that is not available in your location. This is basically what I've been using NordVPN the most for. Whenever there is something that I really need to access but it's not available in Poland, NordVPN comes to the rescue. And if you get it today following the link nordvpn.com/Karolina, you can get an exclusive 2-year deal and a bonus gift. It's easy to use, all it takes is a couple of clicks. You can use it on 6 devices at once, and NordVPN is also the fastest VPN out there. And in case you're not convinced yet, there is a 30-day money-back guarantee. Oh my god. So please follow the link nordvpn.com/Karolina to get your special deal today. Back to the video. When we're reviewing something from a not so distant past, there is often this gap between modern sensitivities and sensitivities 30 years prior. There might be certain elements that we simply, to put it lightly, don't appreciate anymore or just straight up find offensive. And unfortunately with 90s fashion shows, there is a couple of things like that, starting with all of the models being incredibly skinny and most of them being white, through some blatant cultural appropriation, the use of real animal fur, to the designers that we have since learned are problematic at best. For the purpose of this video, I want to focus solely on the visual aspect of it. Like, I'm gonna skip all of the stuff that I think is inappropriate, so we're not gonna look at that, but if you find any of those elements in the remaining looks, for the purpose of this video, let's just focus on what we see. Let's look at it as a particular time in fashion history. For me personally, the reason 1998 rocked so hard was how many so iconic, famous collections happened at the same time, and how many now legendary designers and creators happened to put out collections in the same year. We have the iconic Thierry Mugler designs that are still worn nowadays on the red carpets by A-list celebrities, or even referenced by the designer himself. We have the Fairy Tale collection by Anna Sui. We have the Alexander McQueen iconic Rain collection, iconic Fire Runway show, both in the same year. And most of all, we have the designer that, while since then has kind of fallen, let's say, to me, he absolutely thrived in the 90s. And he absolutely thrived in 1998 in particular, which is John Galliano, who designed both for Dior and his own label at the same time. Not a single of his collections from that year were a miss. Unfortunately, Galliano had a tendency to include elements in his work that nowadays smell of Orientalism, but the looks that are free from that and the looks that still work in a modern context work exquisitely, dare I say. There is the absolutely iconic 1920s inspired Dior show that also had some inspiration from like a transitional period between the teens and the 20s. There is the 1930s inspired boudoir style Galliano show. There is another Dior show which was sort of 20s, 30s, 50s meets shocking pink. Apart from the vintage style inspirations, a lot of the designers that year were inspired by older historical styles, let's say. Mostly 18th century. We have the 1998 Jean-Paul Gaultier spring summer show with both Victorian and 18th century inspirations. We have Vivienne Westwood and her signature corseted looks. And while Yohji Yamamoto's collection doesn't directly resemble any particular era, there's this one look that was clearly a modern take on this 19th century caricature. On the other hand, a lot of iconic fashion houses chose the completely opposite direction in 1998. A strictly minimalistic route. There is a black and white Balenciaga collection, black and white Louis Vuitton, simple looks from Gianni Versace Atelier, simple Gucci looks that look like honestly something straight from a modern shop. Like, it just gives It's giving Zara. There is elegant gowns from Yves Saint Laurent, sporty Calvin Klein fits. I have to say, apart from the clothes themselves, I really love how back then a fashion show was really a show. Like, models were showing off. Now that's a thing that you don't see on runways nowadays because, let's face it, it can be a little cheesy, but it's honestly just so much more entertaining to watch. To be fair, it's also more demanding of the models. Like in this John Galliano show, they had to basically full-on act, and you can clearly tell which one of them are more comfortable and less comfortable in that position. But in general, it's just so fun to watch them interact and play characters that are in line with the clothes they're wearing. Same with the Jean-Paul Gaultier show. Some models even had assigned characters that they were playing, and it really shows in the way they pose. Like Tanel Bedrosian's, here. He was supposed to be a marquise, and I think it really comes through in the way he carries himself on the runway. I'm assuming apart from fun or more theatrical fashion shows not being trendy anymore, is also probably for publicity reasons. Like, it's so much easier to have models walk straight in front of the camera with like a neutral face expression than to trust the photographers to capture the clothes well when the models are talking, laughing, or rolling on the bed. One thing I noticed though was the people watching those shows. If you have a look at like front rows on shows like that, there's no actors, there's no influencers, obviously, because like back then it wasn't really a thing, but also it's just fashion people, and it's really interesting how most of them look completely normal and kind of plain even. Like, they seem to be just journalists, editors, assistants, friends of the designer even, and not necessarily people that went there because it's a good look and it's what they're supposed to do. Also, it's interesting how back in 1998 there used to be a lot of brands that didn't really survive, and in most cases if we heard their names we wouldn't even be able to tell what sort of clothes they used to make. My theory is that apart from like fashion brands and fashion houses naturally falling apart, there is always some brands that simply won't make it through time. There's also this thing where during that transition from fashion shows being a parade of styles that you could wear if you had enough money, to runway fashion being basically art pieces which would vaguely show the direction in which fashion was heading next. In between that, I think some fashion brands and labels were simply left behind because they didn't necessarily follow that change. They stayed traditional, and sticking to tradition really doesn't work in the fashion industry where you constantly have to be innovative. Also, the more I looked at the photos from 1998 shows, the more I was like, wait a minute, isn't that what we're wearing now? And it's not only like this style of clothes, but have a look at these Maison Margiela boots from a 1998 show. Anyway, were all the fashion shows from 1998 good? Of course not. But I have to say, there's a relatively small amount of flops within like the major fashion houses and labels. Like, the only shows I would say were a bit of a miss that year were probably Chanel shows. Like, the clothes aren't necessarily awful to look at, but especially compared to other fashion houses at the time, they're not too cutting edge either. They're just a little weird but not shocking enough to make an impact, and not classy enough for us to consider them like wow nowadays after all these years. But I think it's safe to say that overall 1998 was a particularly impactful year of fashion that gave inspiration for decades to come. It established some classic looks that we nowadays associate with iconic fashion houses, and it also happened to be a time when so many famous designers were in their absolute prime. And that's without even mentioning who wore those clothes. Like, that was peak 90s supermodel era. It just so happened that in that time there were so many absolute modeling stars that are still iconic to this day. So 1998 is just it. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, bye!